Welcome to How Ecology Works. In this podcast, we cover all topics in ecology and how you might apply them in your future career. So hey everybody, welcome back to How Ecology Works. I'm here with Dr. Amanda Subalusky, and she is the expert on, or at least from my opinion, I'll let her tell you more about herself, but she's an expert on animal resource subsidies and how important they are in the ecosystems. So Dr. Subalusky, could you tell us more about what that means and maybe give us some examples from your own experience?
Sure, absolutely. So a resource subsidy is a resource that is fixed through the production regime in one ecosystem and then moved across the boundary into another ecosystem where it influences the ecosystem dynamics of the recipient ecosystem. So they're also referred to as allochthonous resources, where allochthonous from other or outside coming in, or spatial subsidies, so a subsidy coming from another space, and sometimes referred to as donor-controlled resources. So it's a resource that comes from a donor system, a donor ecosystem, and is moved into a recipient ecosystem. So there's some of the different terminology that can be used when referring to this concept. But the idea is essentially a resource from one place moved into another place that has an ecological effect. And the kind of a classic example, at least for folks in the temperate part of the world, are leaves falling from forests into streams. Every fall, you see a bunch of leaves that kind of collect on the surface of a lake or the surface of a stream. And that is a resource subsidy. It's resource production that was fixed in the terrestrial system, and it's been moved into the aquatic system. And those leaves have a really important role that they play in the aquatic ecosystem. Once there, they provide food for consumers, they influence nutrient cycling, they influence whole system carbon budgets. And so, but resource subsidies can kind of happen in a variety of different shapes and forms. And my particular research is focused on animal resource subsidies. So we can kind of classify resource subsidies broadly into two categories: ones that are transferred by abiotic vectors. So this would be things like wind or gravity or rain. So when leaves fall, dead leaves fall off of a tree, they fall by gravity down into streams. When organic material, sticks, leaves are washed off a hill slope down, often into rivers, they're transferred by gravity and by rainfall. When things, dust and the accompanying phosphorus is blown from the Sahara by wind into the Amazon, that's a subsidy. A fair amount of the phosphorus budget in the Amazon comes from Saharan dust, and that's a spatial subsidy that's transferred by wind. Animals, the other category are biotic subsidies. So resource subsidies that are moved around the landscape by a living vector. And what's unique about biotic subsidies is because the vector, the thing that moves it, is alive, it can move it in different ways. It can move it kind of against these kind of traditional, like gravitational pathways, upslope or upstream. Think of fish moving resources up a river versus an abiotic subsidy that's floating downriver. They can move it kind of along natural gradients, but at a much faster rate. So whereas it might take, decades for, a dead log from the top of a mountain to make it down to the river, an animal can move some of the carbon and nitrogen in a matter of minutes. Animal resource subsidies also tend to be very, higher in what we are often think of as limiting nutrients. So they can be very high in nitrogen and phosphorus. They usually take the form of animals eating nutrients in one place and then going to another ecosystem where they either excrete them through urine or feces, or they die and transfer it in the form of a carcass, or they maybe reproduce and transfer it in the form of like a hatchling or a baby. And finally, animal resource subsidies, because animals tend to aggregate in space and time, they can occur in these really big kind of pulses. to recap, animals can move them along natural gradients, but at a faster rate. They can move them against natural gradients. They tend to aggregate them in space and time, and they can be high in limiting nutrients. So they can be really important subsidies to the recipient ecosystem that they occur in. So some examples that you all might be familiar with are Pacific salmon. This is an anadromous fish. That means that it is born in freshwater systems in the Pacific Northwest. I'm thinking of Pacific salmon, but this is for any anadromous salmon population. They're born in headwater streams. They move downstream and spend much of their life in a marine system where they accrue a lot of their adult biomass, and then they swim back upstream to spawn. And certain species are known as simulparous, which means when they spawn, they die. And so they've transferred a bunch of marine nutrients that they accrued while they were growing out there, getting bigger and bigger. All of the nitrogen that is in their body is in the form of is from the ocean system. And when they swim back upstream, they're transferring a lot of that marine nitrogen back maybe 100 or 200 kilometers into these inland streams that would never have received marine nitrogen through any other pathway. And that nitrogen can play an important role in the food web and ecosystem dynamics of those streams. A lot of my research has focused in the Eastern Africa, where there's a lot of large animals kind of moving around the landscape. And I've studied the role of hippos and wildebeest eating in savanna grasslands and then coming to the river. Hippos spend their day wallowing there, and they transfer a lot of those savanna grass resources into the river through excretion, through feces and urine. And wildebeest, which because the river acts as a bit of a boundary during these migratory movements, they can transfer a lot of resources from the grasslands in as carcasses when they drown in the river. So I study the way that these different forms of animal subsidies influence the river ecosystem. So some of the really cool work on animal subsidies has looked at subsidies, reciprocal subsidies that move where animals move resources from terrestrial systems into aquatic systems and then back again. And so if you think again, go back to this kind of a temperate forested stream running through a forest, during times of the year when there's lots of leaves on the trees, you have insects that are feeding on those leaves and occasionally dropping off into the stream below. And during that time of the year, they're providing a really important food resource to the fishes in the river. But then during early spring, before leaf out has occurred, when a lot of the aquatic insects are emerging, they're also providing an important food resource, but they're emerging now and flying back into the terrestrial system and providing an important resource for birds in those forested canopies as they await the kind of leaf out and the terrestrial insects that accompany them. So you have this really elegant link between terrestrial and aquatic systems happening on an annual basis, on a seasonal basis, through the cross-system movements of animals between those two systems.
Yeah, I really love that you're basically showing us how interlinked things are, not just even within an ecosystem, but across them, and then sometimes animals and organisms are connecting them. And just thinking about the sheer number of relationships like that is mind-boggling, right? Across the planet. Like, these kinds of things are happening in all kinds of systems all the time. And that for me is exciting in ecology, one of the most exciting things that I can think about even.
Absolutely. And if you think about the way that animals, especially historically, animal populations kind of moved across whole landscapes and across continental scales, even during these long distance migrations, and how those movement patterns may have kind of historically linked ecosystems. Some really cool work has shown that, we often, nutrients are kind of gravitationally moving in one direction, right? They erode off hill slopes, down into streams, down into rivers, and down into the ocean, where they eventually sink to the bottom of the ocean. It's a one-way trip for nutrients from the mountains to the bottom of the ocean. But it's animals that are able to move them back upstream. So whales feed down in the lower reaches, and their fecal plumes bring those nutrients to the surface. Diatoms, algae, small zooplankton feed on those resources that then are consumed by seabirds and fishes that move upstream, like the salmon and seabirds that move these resources back to the land, back upstream. Salmon and other fish nutrients then, as they die, are consumed by scavengers that move them inland and can fuel, production by riparian forests. And so it's basically the return trip of nutrients back upriver. And it's animals that are able to do that. But we've lost so many of the animal populations that kind of historically did that. There's work by Chris Dowdy and others that estimates the current ability of animals to relocate nutrients has declined to about 6% of what it would have been at historical levels.
Wow. Yeah, that's incredible that it's been that impaired, but also I think that's a really awesome idea to think about. Exactly what you said is, part of the return of the nutrients, part of that cycle, it must involve biota. So that's really cool. So thanks again for coming on the show. I really appreciate it, and that was awesome content, and I think we all learned a lot from it.
Thanks for having me.